On the evening of 6th of February 1902, on the barrier island of Palm Beach, along Whitehall Way, a maid in a blue and white uniform closes a heavy white door at the end of the second-floor family corridor. Inside, the new Mrs. Mary Lily Kenan Flagler is having her hair pinned for dinner. Outside, gaslight glows on the paneled walls, and the marble stair hall below hums with arriving guests. Earlier that day, the New York Herald had hailed Whitehall, the 55-room mansion her husband built as a wedding gift, as more wonderful than any palace in Europe, grander and more magnificent than any other private dwelling in the world. The paper showed ballrooms, loggias, and galleries. It did not show the narrow corridor that leads from the master suite toward smaller tucked-away rooms where family and staff can disappear from view. As the maid turns the polished brass knob, the click is small but final. The party is for the third Mrs. Flagler. The second Mrs. Flagler, declared insane in New York and confined to a private asylum, will never see this house. The door closes, and with it, a part of the story is quietly written out of the frame. By 1893, when Henry Morrison Flagler paid $50,000 for a strip of land between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth in Palm Beach, Florida, the Florida East Coast Railway he controlled already reached deep into the state. The purchase records describe the parcel simply as beachfront acreage. Later narratives make clear he was assembling not just another hotel site, but a personal enclave at the southern end of his rail and hotel empire. The land would become Whitehall, a winter home whose scale rivaled the resort palaces he built for paying guests. The timing of the land acquisition matters. In the early 1890s, Flagler was at the height of his powers as a railroad builder and hotelier, but his personal life was beginning to fracture. His first wife, Mary Harkness, had died in 1881. His second wife, Ida Alice Shords, whom he married in 1883, was showing signs of what contemporary physicians would diagnose as mental instability. By 1893, as he surveyed his new Palm Beach property, the marriage that had begun with optimism was deteriorating into crisis. At the same time, the private life that would inhabit that land was under strain. Ida Alice had been institutionalized off and on since 1896, after a physician friend, Dr. George Anderson, declared her insane. Letters and later biographies describe her obsession with a Ouija board and her belief that she would marry the Russian Tsar. Court records from 1899 show New York judges appointing a committee over her person and estate when she was committed to a sanatorium in Pleasantville, New York. The institutional records paint a picture of progressive deterioration. Ida Alice's symptoms included delusions, violent outbursts, and paranoid beliefs that she was being poisoned. Whether these were genuine psychiatric conditions or misdiagnosed spiritual interests remains debated in modern scholarship, but the effect was the same. She was removed from society, placed under medical supervision, and eventually stripped of legal autonomy over her own person and property. On paper, the Palm Beach land and the Pleasantville institution are separate lines. In practice, they are part of the same operation. Remove one wife from public view, prepare a stage for another, build a house that can host winter balls while private corridors keep certain absences from being mentioned. Each time a door closes on a convalescent room up north, plans advance for a new suite facing the Florida sun. Flagler's vision for the property was ambitious from the start. He wanted something that would rival the great estates of Newport and the mansions of Fifth Avenue, but in a tropical setting that would serve as the crown jewel of his Florida empire. The land was perfect. Ocean on one side, lake on the other, enough space to create gardens, grounds, and the kind of buffer that would separate a private residence from the tourists and winter visitors who filled his nearby hotels. In the property ledgers, it looks like simple expansion. In the court dockets, it looks like subtraction, a businessman acquiring real estate, a husband arranging care for an ill wife, each action defensible on its own terms, but together forming a pattern that would define the next decade of Flagler's life. In March 1899, in a New York courtroom far from palm trees, Ida Alice Flagler was declared legally insane. A committee took control of her person and estate. Her husband's lawyer, Eugene Ashley, eventually became her guardian. Testimony and later summaries describe her as fixated on spiritualism, prone to violent outbursts, and convinced that she was being poisoned. a pattern that had already led to previous commitments. The courtroom proceedings were clinical, brief, and one-sided. Ida Alice herself was not present for much of the testimony about her condition. Physicians testified to her delusions, her inability to manage her affairs, her danger to herself and possibly others. The legal standard for commitment was not high in 1899, and the testimony of respected doctors carried enormous weight. Within hours, a woman who had been the wife of one of America's richest men was legally reduced to the status of an incompetent person requiring permanent supervision. That same spring, Flagler shifted his legal residence from New York to Florida, a move documented in both biographical timelines and contemporary press. In Florida, divorce laws were more malleable. In New York, insanity was not an acceptable ground for dissolving a marriage. Business correspondence shows him still organizing rail extensions in hotels. Personal letters and journalist investigations later suggest that he was also quietly lobbying for a statute that would let him legally separate from a wife confined to a sanatorium. The shift in legal residence was strategic and deliberate. Florida was still developing its legal infrastructure, and its legislature was more amenable to influence from powerful businessmen who had literally built the state's railroad network and tourism economy. Flagler's move wasn't just about warmer winters. It was about accessing a legal system that might be persuaded to see his marital situation differently than New York's courts would. The human conditions inside Pleasantville, noise from the ward, the smell of disinfectant, the routine of attendants locking and unlocking doors, are only glimpsed through later memoirs and secondary accounts. They underline a fact the Florida land does not. The second, Mrs. Flagler's world was getting smaller as the footprint of her husband's ambitions grew. Somewhere in that New York building, a nurse turns a key after the evening rounds, the same gesture servants in Palm Beach will one day make at the end of the upstairs family corridor. The asylum, promoted as a progressive facility with gardens and humane treatment, was still fundamentally a locked institution. Patients lived according to schedules not of their choosing, took medications prescribed by doctors they hadn't selected, and received visitors only when approved by administrators. For Ida Alice, the reality was permanent confinement with no prospect of release, no matter how the facility's promotional materials described it. The legal mechanism that placed her there, the insanity commitment, also ensured she would never leave. Once declared legally insane, she had no standing to challenge her confinement, no right to demand release, and no ability to manage her own financial affairs. The committee appointed to control her person and estate effectively had lifetime authority as long as the medical diagnosis stood. In one jurisdiction, a door closes on a patient. In another, a legislator opens a file on a new divorce law. The distance between New York and Florida measured more than miles. It measured the difference between a legal system that would preserve Flagler's marriage and one that might dissolve it. On 14 August 1901, in Florida, Henry Flagler obtained a divorce from Ida Alice under a new law that recognized incurable insanity as grounds for dissolution. The law, historians note, was passed after direct lobbying and financial support from Flagler and was repealed only a few years later. He was the only person ever divorced under its terms before it was withdrawn. The legislative process was remarkably swift. The bill was introduced, debated, and passed within a single session, with Flagler's political allies ensuring its smooth passage. Critics at the time noted the suspicious timing. A law tailored precisely to one man's circumstances, passed with minimal opposition, and applied exactly once before being quietly removed from the books. Later scholars would describe it as perhaps the most blatant example of personal legislation in Florida's history. Newspaper articles from 1901 report both the legislative change and the swift sequence that followed. Ida, still confined in New York, remained legally incompetent. Within 10 days of the divorce decree, on 24 August 1901, Flagler married Mary Lily Kenan at her family's plantation, Liberty Hall, in North Carolina. Behind them lay nearly a decade of acquaintance, social visits in Newport, and a growing intimacy that had already prompted gossip in the late 1890s. Mary Lily Kenan came from a prominent North Carolina family with connections to the Southern aristocracy. She was 34 years old when she married Flagler, who was 71, a May-December romance that combined her social grace with his vast wealth. Contemporary accounts describe her as charming, cultured, and well-educated, a woman who moved comfortably in elite social circles and understood the expectations of her new position. The legal records read like a series of bureaucratic steps: petition, statute, decree. For Ida Alice, the effect was simpler. The man whose name she still carried in institutional paperwork was now remarried, and her status shifted from inconvenient spouse to pension dependent. Flagler established a trust fund for her, stocked with Standard Oil stock worth about $2 million at the time, enough to keep her confined in relative comfort until her death in 1930. The trust was generous in financial terms, but unambiguous in its purpose. Ida Alice would be cared for, but at a distance, with no expectation that she would ever rejoin society or have any role in her former husband's life. The income from Standard Oil dividends would pay for the best private asylum care available, for nurses and attendants, for clothes and personal items, everything except freedom. He had not solved the problem of her illness. He had rearranged where that illness fit in his public life. The key that unlocked his future marriage also turned another lock on Ida's custodial door. The two events, divorce and remarriage, were legally separate but functionally linked, a before and after sequence that transformed Flagler's domestic arrangements while leaving his former wife's situation fundamentally unchanged. On the statute books, it was reform. In the asylum register, it meant the patient's husband would never again come to take her home. The door to her room in Pleasantville would continue to close each night, but now the man who had placed her there was building a palace in Florida for someone else. By summer 1900, surveyors were marking foundations on Flagler's Palm Beach land. Construction proceeded at remarkable speed. The mansion, designed by Carrere and Hastings, rose between 1900 and early 1902, a Beaux-Arts shell enclosing ballrooms, galleries, and private suites. According to later summaries drawing on original shop orders and plans, Whitehall contained about 55,075 rooms and roughly 60 to 100,000 square feet of space, depending on whether service areas are counted. The architectural firm of Carrere and Hastings was one of the most prestigious in America, known for the New York Public Library and other monumental buildings. For Whitehall, they designed a structure that combined classical symmetry with tropical adaptation: marble exterior to withstand humidity, high ceilings for air circulation, loggias, and arcades to capture breezes. Every detail was calculated to impress while remaining functional in Florida's climate. A redrawn second-floor plan shows the master suite of Henry and Mary Lily Flagler positioned on the ocean side, buffered by guest rooms in a series of 22 servants' rooms with 19 bathrooms arranged to serve both family and guests. This layout created a domestic backstage. Family and staff could move along interior corridors largely unseen by visitors circulating between the grand staircase, the music room, and the loggias. The spatial organization was deliberate and sophisticated. Public rooms occupied the ground floor: grand hall, music room, drawing room, library, billiard room, each designed to flow into the next for large gatherings. The second floor was divided into zones: the master suite at the ocean end, guest rooms along the central corridor, and servants' rooms tucked into the corners and back sections. This arrangement meant that the family's private life could unfold without being visible to guests, and servants could perform their duties without intruding on the public spectacle below. On the 6th February 1902, sources note that Henry and Mary Lily moved into Whitehall for the winter season. Society columns describe dinners, musicals, and receptions. The New York Herald's feature that March devoted 2 illustrated pages to the house, calling it a new palace of an American, and marveling at the speed with which artists of the world hard worked to finish Whitehall. The Herald's coverage was breathless and uncritical, describing marble columns, painted ceilings, imported tapestries, and furnishings that rivaled European palaces. Photographs showed the grand hall with its twin marble staircases, the music room with its Louis XV decor, the Italian Renaissance library with its carved woodwork. What the photographs didn't show were the service stairs, the back corridors, the spaces designed for invisibility. Nothing in those accounts mentions what the floor plans make obvious. The master bedroom suite is not on display. Its door sits at the top of the marble stair, just around a turn. A servant can close it in one smooth motion before the first guest comes up. The house allows the public to see almost everything, except where the marriage sleeps. The architectural logic was clear: maximum visibility for social spaces, maximum privacy for personal ones. Guests could wander through public rooms, admire the art and furnishings, marvel at the scale and expense, but they could not enter the family quarters without explicit invitation. The master suite was a sanctuary and control room both, a place where the performance of hospitality could be paused and real life could resume. In the photographs, Whitehall is all windows and light. In the architectural drawings, it also contains shadows and dead ends, corridors that lead nowhere, rooms that appear on plans but not in publicity materials, spaces designed to accommodate what couldn't be shown. By January 1903, Henry and Mary Lily were settled into a rhythm at Whitehall. Passenger timetables show their private railcar, number 91, bringing them down the East Coast line to Palm Beach each winter, then pulling into a spur not far from the house. On arrival days, staff accounts and later museum reconstructions show a sequence of routines: trunks carried up to the second-floor master suite, linens aired, shutters opened along the lake and ocean sides, doors checked and closed along the private corridors before guests saw anything. The private railcar was itself a demonstration of wealth and control, a mobile palace that allowed the Flaglers to travel between New York and Florida without mingling with ordinary passengers. Fitted with bedrooms, a dining area, observation deck, and servants' quarters, car number 91 was essentially Whitehall compressed into rolling stock. The journey took days, but the Flaglers traveled in complete privacy and comfort. Public rooms on the ground floor, grand hall, music room, drawing room, were designed to impress winter society. Upstairs, the master suite functioned as a quieter command post. Contemporary descriptions emphasize that Henry conducted business in a private office off the main hall and in his bedroom sitting area, scanning letters from railroad managers and hotel superintendents while servants moved through side hallways. Even in winter retreat, Flagler remained actively engaged in business. Telegrams arrived daily with updates on railroad operations, hotel bookings, real estate developments. He reviewed financial reports, approved major expenditures, made decisions about route extensions and new construction. The line between leisure and work was porous. Whitehall was simultaneously a vacation home and a remote headquarters. For Mary Lily, the suite was both stage and refuge. Invitations and press write-ups describe her hosting musicales and teas. North Carolina family papers note that she brought relatives to stay in the guest rooms, using the house to consolidate her role as mistress of a new social world. Yet there were rules. Some rooms remained firmly family-only, their doors habitually shut when tours of party guests moved through. Mary Lily's social position required constant performance. She was not just Mrs. Flagler. She was the hostess of one of America's great houses, expected to entertain with grace, manage a large staff, maintain relationships with other elite families, and represent her husband's success. The master suite was where that performance could be suspended, where she could be tired, irritable, or simply herself without the need to project perfection. Each night, a housemaid made her round on the second floor, turning down beds, checking fireplaces, and closing doors. The gesture that protected privacy also ensured that no visitor glimpsed tiredness, arguments, or illness. The nightly routine was mechanical but meaningful, a ritual that restored the boundary between public and private, ensuring that morning would find everything once again in perfect order. In the visitor's notebook, Whitehall was all glitter and music. In the servant's log, there was a nightly list: doors secured. The servant's perspective, rarely recorded in detail, hints at a different understanding of the house, not as a palace of leisure, but as a complex machine requiring constant maintenance, vigilance, and discretion. The 22 servants' rooms held chambermaids, cooks, valets, laundresses, gardeners, and other staff whose labor made the spectacle possible, but who were themselves meant to be invisible. The contrast between public splendor and private routine was not unique to Whitehall, but its scale made the division particularly stark. Guests might spend an evening marveling at marble and gilt, never seeing the back stairs where servants carried linens and trays, the service corridors where orders were given and work was coordinated, the small rooms where exhausted staff slept after 18-hour days. While orchestras played in Palm Beach, Ida Alice Flagler remained in the background of documents, if not in the house itself. By 1897, she had been put away for good in a sanatorium in Pleasantville, New York, later identified as Falkirk, a private institution promoted at the time as a humane asylum on 150 acres. Falkirk represented the progressive wing of mental health care in the late 19th century. Private, expensive, designed to look more like an estate than an asylum. Promotional materials emphasized gardens, fresh air, occupational therapy, and respectful treatment. But the fundamental reality remained custodial. Patients lived in a locked facility under constant supervision with no right to leave. Reports from Falkirk highlight gardens, open air, and progressive treatment, but the core reality remained custodial. Patients lived under supervision, their days punctuated by medication rounds, scheduled walks, and the sound of doors locking for the night. In Ida's case, guardianship papers and trust records underscore that her life would be financed at a distance. Flagler stocked a trust with Standard Oil shares, whose value would reach more than $15 million by her death in 1930. The trust's value fluctuated with the stock market, but Standard Oil was one of the most stable investments in America. The income generated was more than sufficient to cover Ida Alice's care at the most expensive private facilities available. She would never lack for material comfort, private rooms, quality food, personal attendance, but she would also never escape institutional life. The contrast with Whitehall is stark. Florida, a master suite has been built for a healthy, socially present wife whose image appears in press photographs and society columns. In New York, the previous wife's existence is reduced to medical files, billing statements, and occasional notes from relatives. For Palm Beach's winter colony, the second Mrs. Flagler is barely a rumor. For the institution's staff, she is another long-term patient whose door must be checked on the night shift. Later accounts suggest that Ida Alice's family maintained some contact with her, visiting when permitted and corresponding with the asylum's administrators. But Flagler himself apparently never visited after the divorce, and Mary Lily certainly didn't. The woman whose diagnosis had enabled the marriage that produced Whitehall remained out of sight, out of mind, a problem solved by distance and institutional walls. The architecture of Whitehall did not hide a mentally ill spouse in a back bedroom. The records show something more ruthless. She was hidden in another state, while a new suite embodied her replacement. The solution was geographical rather than architectural, using the distance between Florida and New York to ensure that the two Mrs. Flaglers would never occupy the same space, never confront the awkwardness of their simultaneous existence. The house in Florida closed its doors to heat, dust, and curiosity. The asylum up north closed its doors on a life that no longer fit the story being told in marble. Both sets of doors performed the same function, keeping certain realities out of view, but one concealed luxury, while the other concealed abandonment. By 1907, Whitehall had fully joined the seasonal circuit of America's wealthy. Guests arrived from New York and Newport, checking into the nearby Royal Poinciana Hotel and other Flagler properties before crossing to the house for dinners. The public rooms were frequently photographed and described in travel writing. The double-height hall, the Louis XV music room, the array of tapestries and gilt. The Royal Poinciana, one of the largest wooden structures in the world at the time, could accommodate over 1,000 guests. Flagler had built it in 1894, before Whitehall, as the anchor of his Palm Beach resort development. The hotel drew the same crowd that summered in Newport, Vanderbilts, Astors, and other Gilded Age dynasties, and Whitehall became the most exclusive private venue in their winter social calendar. Little attention was paid to what was above. Architectural drawings and later interpretive materials show that the second floor's circulation allowed staff to move between 22 servants' rooms and 14 guest rooms without entering the ceremonial sequence. This was efficient domestic planning. It was also a way of ensuring that anything inconvenient, fatigue, illness, even conflict, could be contained behind closed doors while the facade remained intact. The servants' circulation system was elegant in its logic. Backstairs connected the service areas on the ground floor with the servants' rooms on the second floor, allowing staff to move vertically without using the grand marble staircase meant for family and guests. Narrow corridors connected servants' rooms to guest rooms so that chambermaids could service bedrooms without being seen in the main hallway. The entire second floor functioned as a stage with carefully designed wings and backstage areas. Flagler, now in his late 70s, was beginning to slow. Biographers note that he increasingly used the master suite as a retreat, holding shorter public evenings and spending more time in his bedroom sitting room, where letters from railroad executives and hotel managers followed him even in winter. For Mary Lily, the private hall outside their rooms was where she could escape the social gaze for a moment, pause by a window, adjust a curtain, straighten a framed photograph on a bedside table before going back downstairs. Age was catching up to a man who had been building empires for decades. Flagler tired more easily, needed more rest, and found the constant socializing more draining. The master suite became not just a private space, but a necessary refuge, a place where he could drop the performance of vitality and vigor that his public role required. Every time she straightened that frame, she made a small correction to the visible world, aligning surfaces so guests would see only what they were meant to. The habit is domestic, almost trivial. It is also the physical echo of a larger project that had already erased one marriage from the rooms of this house. In the guest books, only one Mrs. Flagler signs her name at Whitehall. The other's signature survives in court records and asylum files that no visitor ever saw. The erasure was complete in the social world that mattered to the Flaglers. No one mentioned Ida Alice at dinner parties. No one asked awkward questions about the previous marriage. No one suggested that the current domestic arrangement rested on a foundation of institutionalization and custom legislation. On 1st May 1913, at Whitehall in Palm Beach, the choreography of doors and corridors broke down. Accounts collected by later historians and local archives agree on the basic outline. The 83-year-old Henry Flagler fell down a marble staircase in the house, suffered severe injuries, and lingered for several weeks before dying on 20th of May 1913. The fall itself was witnessed by servants, but details remain sparse in the archival record. Whether he tripped, lost his balance, or suffered some medical episode that caused the fall is unclear. What is documented is the severity of the injuries, broken bones, internal injuries, the kind of trauma from which an 83-year-old body cannot easily recover. Doctors and nurses moved through the same corridors once used for servants, carrying bandages, medicine, and reports. For the first time, the master suite and surrounding rooms became a sick room complex rather than a private retreat. The man who had used doors to manage, who saw what was now the object of others' management, his movements restricted, his visitors filtered, his world reduced to a bed and the view from his windows. The transformation of the suite from sanctuary to hospital ward happened quickly. Medical equipment appeared, bedpans, syringes, bandages, bottles of medication. Nurses rotated shifts, monitoring vital signs, administering care, recording symptoms. The smell changed from perfume and fresh flowers to disinfectant and illness. The sounds changed from conversation and music to labored breathing and hushed medical consultations. His will, probated soon after, left the bulk of his fortune, including his Florida holdings, to Mary Lily, making her for a time one of the richest women in the world. Ida Alice, still confined, received income from the trust established years earlier. The house that had served as a winter stage for his third marriage now became, in effect, a widow's palace and a monument to its builder. The estate was valued at approximately $100 million, an enormous fortune in 1913. Mary Lily inherited Whitehall, the hotels, the railroad interests, the real estate holdings, essentially everything except what was already set aside for Ida Alice's care. At 46, she found herself wealthier than she could have imagined, but also suddenly alone in a vast house designed for entertaining and social performance. Once he died, staff once again closed the bedroom door at night, this time in a room that contained absence rather than power. The door that had shielded his privacy now sealed in the echo of the fall that killed him. The master suite, so carefully designed to be a place of rest and retreat, had become the scene of his final struggle and defeat. In the death certificate, he dies of injuries from a fall. In the house's memory, he dies at the point where marble steps meet gravity and age. The irony was noted by some contemporary observers. The man who had built monuments to progress and modernity, who had tamed wilderness and built a railroad to the sea, was killed by a simple misstep in his own palace. After Henry's death, Mary Lily Kenan Flagler split her time between Whitehall and family properties in Wilmington, North Carolina. By 1916, she'd married again, this time to Robert Worth Bingham, a Kentucky newspaper publisher, in a union that would later generate scandal and speculation. Bingham was a widower with 3 children, a man of social ambition, but limited means compared to Mary Lily's vast wealth. Their courtship was relatively brief, and the marriage in November 1916 surprised many who knew her. Some saw it as a widow seeking companionship. Others suspected Bingham saw an opportunity to secure his financial future. In July 1917, Mary Lily died in Wilmington after a period of declining health, with contemporaneous sources citing heart trouble and heavy use of alcohol. Her will and the codicils that followed became the focus of legal and journalistic scrutiny. Had Bingham influenced her to revise her bequests? Did the changes reflect her genuine wishes or manipulation? Some authors later argued that he might have poisoned her. Others note that no direct evidence supports that claim, and that her death was likely from natural causes exacerbated by addiction. The suspicions centered on a codicil added shortly before her death that left Bingham $5 million, a vast sum that transformed him from a struggling publisher into a wealthy man. The timing, combined with accounts of Mary Lily's deteriorating health and increased drinking during the brief marriage, fueled speculation. Bingham's own children later questioned whether their father had manipulated or even harmed their stepmother, though no criminal charges were ever filed. Whitehall, during these years, was less a home than an asset. Her heirs eventually sold the property in 1924 to developers, who converted it into the Whitehall Hotel by adding a 12-story tower and reconfiguring internal spaces. The original master suite, once the symbolic heart of a marriage that displaced another, was absorbed into a commercial floor plan, its doors repurposed for guests who knew nothing of Ida's asylum or Mary Lily's contested legacy. The hotel conversion was dramatic and destructive. A towering addition was grafted onto the original Beaux-Arts structure, completely altering its proportions and appearance. Interior walls were moved or removed, original finishes covered over, grand spaces subdivided into hotel rooms and corridors. The spatial logic that had carefully separated public from private was erased in favor of maximum room count and rental efficiency. The human cost of these transitions lies in probate records and obituaries. A widow who did not live long enough to stabilize her own story, a house that shifted from private theater to public lodging. Mary Lily had been Mrs. Flagler for only 4 years before his death, then a widow for 3 years, then a new bride for less than 8 months before her own death. Her time as mistress of Whitehall was brief, and her legacy became entangled in questions about money, manipulation, and mysterious illness. On the hotel brochure, Whitehall became an amenity list. In the coroner's report in Wilmington, it remained the place where a particular line of marriage had begun. The mansion that had represented the pinnacle of Gilded Age domestic achievement was now just another commercial property, its romantic and tragic history reduced to marketing copy about historic charm. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, hotel guests walked halls where servants and family once moved. Photographs in historic American buildings. Survey documents show Whitehall's original fabric partially obscured by the attached tower, its Beaux-Arts facade now the front of a resort complex. The hotel years were not kind to the building's architectural integrity. Original. Plasterwork was damaged, marble was chipped, wooden floors were worn down by thousands of guests. The delicate balance of the original design, the careful proportions, the thoughtful details, the quality materials, was overwhelmed by the demands of commercial hospitality. What had been designed as a single-family palace was now a facility serving hundreds of guests per season. The second-floor plan that had once balanced the master suite, guest rooms, and servants' quarters now supported a different form of circulation. Bellhops pushing luggage carts, maids changing sheets for short-term visitors, staff operating under hotel protocols rather than a single family's schedule. Remnants of the old hierarchy persisted. Historical descriptions of the estate note that servants' spaces, including a separate building for black laundry workers on the northwest lawn, remained physically and socially distinct, a division that mirrored the wider racial and class stratifications of Florida tourism. The Jim Crow South shaped every aspect of the hotel's operation. Black workers occupied the lowest positions, laundry, kitchen help, grounds maintenance, and lived in segregated quarters. They entered through separate entrances, used separate facilities, and had minimal contact with white guests. The architectural separation of servant spaces that had been a feature of the original mansion was intensified under the hotel's regime, codifying racial hierarchies in spatial terms. By 1959, hotel operations had ceased, and the building, altered and worn, was at risk of demolition. It was saved not by a branch of the family that had once shut doors upstairs, but by Jean Flagler Matthews, Henry's granddaughter, who formed a non-profit corporation to purchase the property and turn it into the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum. Matthews had her own complicated relationship to the family legacy. As a granddaughter rather than a direct heir, she had grown up with the stories of Whitehall's glory days, but had not directly benefited from the fortune that built it. Her decision to rescue the building and convert it to a museum was partly familial piety, partly historical preservation, and partly an attempt to control how her grandfather's story would be told to future generations. Hotel guests had walked through the former master suite without knowing it. The museum that followed would invite visitors to see those rooms as they once were, but even then, some doors would remain closed, now for preservation rather than discretion. The cycle continued. Doors that once protected privacy now protected artifacts, but the fundamental gesture, closing, locking, controlling access, remained the same. On 6th of February 1960, exactly 58 years after Henry and Mary Lily first moved into Whitehall, the newly formed museum opened the house to the public with a restoration ball. Jean Flagler Matthews and fellow trustees oversaw a program of architectural restoration that removed the hotel tower by 1963, reconstructed missing interiors where possible, and repatriated original furnishings. The Historic American Building Survey documented the structure in detail, noting its significance as one of the great houses of Gilded Age America. The restoration process was painstaking and expensive. The hotel tower's removal alone required careful demolition to avoid damaging the original structure. Interior spaces had to be reconstructed based on historical photographs, architectural drawings, and surviving fragments. Original furnishings that had been sold off during the hotel conversion were tracked down at auction houses and private collections and brought back to Whitehall. The second-floor master suite was reinterpreted as the intimate core of the house, Henry's bedroom, Mary Lily's adjoining room, and associated dressing spaces. Period furniture, textiles, and decorative arts were arranged to approximate their appearance during the 1902-1913 seasons. Visitors, now paying admission, were guided along routes that deliberately included the family rooms that had once been withheld from view. The decision to show the private quarters was both historical and commercial. Visitors wanted to see where the Flaglers actually lived, not just the public rooms designed for entertaining. The bedroom suite offered a glimpse of intimacy and domesticity that made the mansion feel like a home rather than just a monument. But there was also an irony. Rooms designed to be private were now the museum's main attraction. Yet, interpretation remained selective. Early museum materials focused on Henry the Builder, railroad magnate, and inventor of modern Florida. The mentally ill second wife appeared rarely, if at all, in the official narrative, and the ethical questions around the insanity-based divorce law were largely absent from tour scripts. Ida's asylum records stayed in archives elsewhere, while her husband's bedroom was carefully dusted and roped off. The museum's founding mission emphasized Flagler's achievements: the railroad that opened Florida to development, the hotels that created the winter resort industry, the vision that transformed a wilderness into a playground for the wealthy. Ida Alice, if mentioned at all, was a footnote, an unfortunate first marriage that ended due to mental illness, nothing more. The controversial divorce law, the suspicious timing, the question of whether her insanity was genuine psychiatric illness or merely inconvenient spiritualism. These complications were deemed inappropriate for family-friendly museum tours. Every evening now, a museum staff member walks the second floor, checking rooms and switching off lights before locking the restored doors. The gesture preserves artifacts, but it also repeats in a new key a century-old habit of deciding what remains visible and what is kept behind wood and brass. In the visitor's brochure, all three Mrs. Flaglers may get a mention in the daily closing. Routine. Only the rooms named for the third are physically tended in front of the public. The pattern established in 1902 persists in modified form. Doors still close, access is still controlled, certain stories are still privileged over others. By the early 21st century, blog posts, walking tours, and local histories began to tell a more complicated story of Whitehall's women. Pieces on doomed wives and haunted houses of Palm Beach highlight Ida Alice's confinement for mental illness and Mary Lily's early death amid allegations, never proven, of poisoning by her second husband, Robert Bingham. The Internet age democratized historical narrative in ways the museum curators couldn't control. Bloggers researched court records, genealogists traced family histories, true crime enthusiasts investigated Mary Lily's suspicious death. The sanitized version of Whitehall's history, promoted by the museum, was challenged by amateur historians armed with Google and access to digitized archives. Some accounts veer into sensationalism, depicting Ida as Crazy Alice, who communed with spirits via Ouija board, and Mary Lily as a ghostly figure roaming Whitehall's halls. Others, drawing on more recent scholarship, emphasize structural factors: a legal system that allowed a powerful husband to reshape divorce law for his own case, medical understandings of mental illness that blurred spiritual belief and pathology, and gendered expectations that left women with few defenses once labeled unfit. The ghost story version of Whitehall's history is more popular but less accurate. Tours marketed as Haunted Palm Beach stop at the mansion and repeat tales of spectral sightings, mysterious sounds, doors that open and close by themselves. These stories sensationalize real tragedies, turning Ida Alice's institutionalization and Mary Lily's early death into entertainment. But they also keep these women's stories circulating in public consciousness in a way the official museum narrative initially failed to do. The museum's own interpretation has gradually expanded. Contemporary educational materials and public talks increasingly acknowledge Ida Alice's institutionalization, the controversial insanity divorce law, and the contested narratives around Mary Lily's death. They remain cautious, distinguishing documented fact from rumor and avoiding definitive claims where sources diverge. Modern historical interpretation demands more nuance and ethical awareness than early 20th century hagiography allowed. The museum has had to reckon with difficult questions. How do you tell the story of a house built on the erasure of an inconvenient wife? How do you acknowledge Flagler's achievements without whitewashing his personal conduct? How do you respect the dead while being honest about the power dynamics and injustices that shaped their lives? Visitors stand now in the master bedroom suite reading wall texts that mention the woman who never saw this house but whose diagnosis made it possible. Outside, preservationists advocate for respectful treatment of historic mental health stories, arguing that houses like Whitehall can illustrate how architecture participated in erasing certain lives. Each time a guide closes a bedroom door at the end of a tour, they are managing light levels and humidity, and, unintentionally, echoing older patterns of exclusion. In the ghost tours, doors slam because of unresolved spirits. In the archives, they close because of legal instruments and medical certificates signed long ago. The two narratives, supernatural and documentary, serve different audiences but circle the same truth. Something was lost in this house, something that can't be fully recovered by restoration and interpretation alone. On a quiet afternoon in late 2025, a school group files out of Whitehall's second-floor corridor, their footsteps fading down the marble stairs. A museum educator lingers in the master bedroom, checking that a velvet rope is secure and that the blinds are set to protect the textiles from Florida sun. The bed is made, the dressing table arranged with brushes and bottles, the framed photograph on the bedside table straightened so its edges align with the lace doily beneath. Outside the windows, cars move along Coconut Row, and tour buses unload at the museum entrance. Inside, the only sound is the low hum of climate control systems and the faint click as the staff member pulls the door gently toward the jamb and turns the key. The lock mechanism is modern, the gesture is not. One door in this house has always been between a story the public is invited to see and the lives that made that story possible. The records in New York still show Ida Alice's long confinement and the trust that kept her away. The files in North Carolina still record the questions around Mary Lily's will and death. The National Historic Landmark paperwork for Whitehall still praises its architecture and its role in the making of modern Florida. None of these documents can capture the small, repeated act of closing a door on a private room so that a public narrative can remain tidy. At closing time, the last light is switched off in the master suite, and the corridor falls into shadow. The polished brass knob gleams faintly in the dark, holding the imprint of hands that have been turning it, for different reasons, for more than a century. What began as a way to keep one woman out of sight now survives as a museum routine. The house stands, the suite is preserved, and somewhere between the open hall and the locked door, the cost remains quietly unsettled.